So, like I said, thank you. Welcome for joining us today. This is a webinar on the potentials and what is at stake of crowdfunding in the ACP countries. Today we're organizing this event in the framework of the ICR facility. So, in short, I'll give you some information about today's agenda. So first we'll have a short introduction, which is what I'm doing now. Then we'll move on and I'll make a short presentation about the ICR Investment Climate Reform Facility, which is organizing this webinar. And then I'll give the floor to Camille Costantini, who works with Mipise, who's a consultant in participatory funding. And we'll have there a presentation on the preliminary results of the report that Camille made. She will explain what is at stake when it comes to crowdfunding in the ACP area. So also we'll see why it is interesting for public decision makers to actually work on this topic and have an in-depth understanding of it. Also, we'll see what are the interesting elements that we need to reckon with, especially when we decide to work with this theme, especially when it comes to public policies. Afterwards, we'll have a roundtable or exchange ideas with different speakers that we'll introduce later on today. And after the roundtable, we'll have a Q&A session. So you see on the screen the agenda. Then on your screen, you have a chat box. There you can write your questions and answers. Of course, we will be able to read that and answer. So during the entire webinar, you can ask questions in writing and we'll try to answer this in the Q&A session. Also have to say that this webinar is being recorded, so you have to know that for legal purposes. And after the Q&A session, we'll make a short presentation on a specificity of the ICR facility. That is that after the webinar, we'll give you the possibility to actually discuss with some of our partners at Mipise, especially if you have in-depth questions on a specific field, for instance. I will give you explanations on that later on. So that's a possibility we're offering to those interested today. So theoretically, we should give the floor to Escipión Gómez, Vice Secretary General in charge of the Economic, Social and Transformation Department at the ACP states, but he had some connection issues, so I'm not sure he's managed to join us. So can you hear us, Mr. Oliveira? So you seem to hear us, but we do not hear you. Could you please turn on your microphone? So this is a technical issue, I guess. Okay, well, unfortunately, I'm sorry for that. We'll have to move on, Mr. Oliveira, because we cannot hear you. But I think he wanted to say that he's very pleased to be there and to have this webinar organized today. To actually be involved in the ICR facilities activities as he usually does. He does it on a very regular basis. So we'll move on with the next item on the agenda. I'll make a short presentation of the ICR facility so that you actually know what it's all about, of course. So this is quite a new facility. It's only 1 year old, actually, so maybe it's new to you. It's called the Investment Climate Reform Facility. Investment Climate Reform for ICR. It's co-funded by the European Union, by the ACP organization, also by the federal state of Germany and the British Council. And it's co-implemented by 4 European cooperation agencies: Expertise France, GIZ, British Council and SND. So the purpose of the facility is to support countries and regional institutions in the ACP area, especially when it comes to fostering private-public dialogue to improve the business environment. So they provide, we provide technical assistance. It's on demand. It's an on-demand approach, and we help public organizations, but also private organizations from the ACP states. And the type of technical support that we provide can actually deal with the reform of the business environment, but also different reforms and actions that will help the business environment to become more sustainable. There we try to include groups that could be underrepresented in some cases, and we propose reforms and activities that will help strengthen private public dialogue, existing dialogue, but also a new type of dialogue that could be under design, being designed. So we'll give you an internet address later on, and there we will provide you with information that aims at improving the business environment. This work should be part of a broader reform process or part of a private-public dialogue. There should be a specific chapter on the public and private dialogue in the framework of the reforms, the design of the reforms that focus on the business environment and development, for instance. And also this should be proposed, and the proposals should come from public and private institutions from the ACP countries. So there again, we're also trying to reply to some requests from the EU delegations in the ACP countries. So Mr. Oliveira, are you back? Yes, I am. Great to have you with us. You have the floor. Well, thank you, everyone. Sorry for my connection, poor connection, but anyway, I'm very pleased to be there. Well, first, I wanted to say I'm very grateful to be here today. I'd like to thank the ACP organizations and countries with the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Nkurikiye. Thank you for this great initiative by ICR. We'd like to thank the EU and all the member states who are providing support to the ICR facility and that work in the framework of the current agreement and partnership agreement, who contribute to the negotiations. And we'd like to thank the ICR team also for their support, because you help us share knowledge. That's interesting. Today's theme is very interesting. I don't know how to translate that in Spanish, which is my mother tongue, but anyway, the purpose is to promote. We want to promote alternative financing systems, because most SMEs, small and medium businesses in our countries, have a hard time accessing traditional financing tools. And very often, you know, it's hard because they need to provide papers and so on to get some funding. It's hard for them to provide all these documents in our countries. So it's not that hard in the countries in the north, but it is in the ACP countries. So there are many systems and mechanisms that could help our countries get additional funding. I mean, our SMEs in our countries get additional funding, and all these tools are welcome. So I think the crowdfunding system is interesting because it's based on human relations and on trust, mutual trust, of course. So when a project is co-funded, there's trust, mutual trust. Also use platforms that we all like. And today, I've seen what you're proposing, and this is a theme which is very dear to me, I must say. One of the people who supported most crowdfunding was President Obama. Actually, I see how he funded his first campaign. It was very interesting, of course. Now we use crowdfunding for many purposes, even to go on holiday, you know. No, it's not exactly the main purpose, but I will pay great attention to what will be said today. I would like to thank all the ICR team and different guest speakers and partners like the British Council, GIZ, the German government, and so on and so on. Thank you for this great initiative. because it's a great honor to be with you here today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Oliveira. So before we give the floor to Camille, I would like to say that this seminar is being translated live. So you are in a Teams session listening to the English interpreting. You're currently listening to the interpreter, and so there's a link also for the people who are still on the other session in French, they can come to us and join us in the English session. So this is the information we're providing them now through the chat box in the other session. Now, we've uploaded a small presentation fact sheet about the ICR facility. So should you be willing to get more information about us, it's also downloadable from the chat box. Now, without further ado, I will give the floor to our first speaker, who's Camille Costantini, and Camille will explain what is at stake, opportunities and challenges for crowdfunding in ACP countries. Well, thank you. I'm Camille, and I work for Mipise. So what is Mipise? It's a French fintech. We specialize in the creation of crowdfunding platforms without a brand. And since 2013, when we were incorporated, we use a participatory approach, and we share our expertise when it comes to technologies, regulations, and advice. And we try to help the participatory finance sector. Of course, we do it in France, but also we do it across the EU. And we work with other countries and regions who could be interested in promoting such crowdfunding initiatives, also crowdsourcing. So this was the task given to us by ICR. We were asked to write a report, short report, on some types of innovative funding mechanisms. And in this particular case, we are focusing on crowdfunding and the opportunities and challenges in the ACP countries. So this report is just a first study. It's a first outline of a situation. There we try to share some thoughts and reflections on the advantages of using crowdfunding in the ACP countries. Now, we paid particular attention to small and medium-sized companies or enterprises in this report. So this report is focusing on public policies, players, ACP countries, all entrepreneurs and companies that could be interested by these mechanisms. So we asked them, when we contacted them, to answer a question. The question is, why should public policies in ACP countries undertake initiatives to promote crowdfunding? So the report consists of 3 parts. First, it's a state of play and the definition of crowdfunding, because not everybody actually knows what crowdfunding is about. So not everybody knows how it works. So we wanted to make a short definition and explain this ecosystem to give you, an assessment of the situation worldwide when it comes to crowdfunding. And the next part will be about the why. The question is, why should the public policies of ACP countries work towards the development of crowdfunding on their territory? And then we take a series of concrete examples. For instance, we focus on corporate funding. And the third part is another question, and it's about recommendations. What are the recommendations to support the use of crowdfunding as an alternative, but also a complementary financial service? So that's the 3 questions. Now, let's start with the first part, which is the state of play and definitions of crowdfunding worldwide, including in the ACP countries. I'll start with a small definition. It's participatory financing. Actually, that's what crowdfunding is all about. It's an online, collective and community-based fundraising system. and it allows a group of contributors to actually fund projects. You have the definition written on the screen. So crowdfunding is not something new. You have public participation, which is not something new, actually. However, what's new here, the innovative part, is the fact that we have an online approach, because now we have new technologies available which enable us to have a 2.0 type of financing. You know, these financing tools propose alternative and digital tools to provide access to different sectors and provide access to funding at all the levels of the development in a company, for instance. So, among the main international platforms in crowdfunding, we have, for instance, Quickstarter. It's just an example. It's one of the pioneers in the sector when it comes to crowdfunding worldwide. It's an American platform created back in 2009 already. So far, they have collected over $5 billion. $5 billion to fund over 2 million projects. They have Indiegogo, which is another US platform, and in France or in Europe, the national champion in France is Give Bang Bang or Ulul, which are two European platforms which have grown international, and they contribute to funding different projects. And they actually available in different languages. So crowdfunding works in a broader ecosystem. It's called alternative finance on the right-hand side of the screen. So it encompasses a set of financial processes and instruments that have emerged outside the traditional financial system, such as banks and regulated capital markets. This term includes multiple tools, such as crowdfunding, like we are focusing on now, but also on-board solidarity, online pools, factoring, corporate loan, funds, consumer loans, and so on and so on and so on. So you should also know that the definition here of alternative finance can change according to one country to another. So what we're proposing today is a definition which tries to cover all the financial instruments that we could include in this ecosystem.
So to get back to crowdfunding, I wanted to explain what types of crowdfunding you can find. So there are three major families of crowdfunding you can define, and then there are subcategories to them. So there's the donation, the loan, and investment. So there is the donation without recompense, donation with reward, and also all the ecosystems linked with pre-purchase and pre-sale. Also the investment side of things and the loan side of things. The non-remunerated loans. Someone knows that he has invested but doesn't get anything back. Then there's also you get a return of investment. And then there is also the other type of bonds. So these are companies that are trying to find the funds that invest in their so they use bonds a lot in the different real estate, for example. There's another category of crowdfunding, which is
So here we propose royalties. What are royalties? So it's a type of investment that allows the contributors to invest, and they contribute to the work of a company. And at the same time, this allows them to enjoy some benefits, rights, or percentage of back of the turnover, or they get something back on the sales made with the product that they supported. After this general definition, we see that we can have crowdfunding on different investment tools. So we need to have a an evaluation of the situation. What is the last study that was made about crowdfunding worldwide? It was back in 2017, so it's hard to assess actually and see what's really there on the market per country and per region. But this is a rough assessment of the situation, I would say. Now, we have to know that in 2017, $34 billion were collected by different crowdfunding platforms worldwide. As you can see here, you have the main champs, United States first. They got $17.2 billion. Then Asia, mostly China, $10.4 billion. Then the EU, which is lagging behind, $6.4 billion. And then Latin America, that's less than $1 billion, only $85 million. Then Oceania, 68 millions, and Africa, 24 millions. So as you can see, this market moves forward with the EU, Asia, and Europe. Why? Well, simply because there is better internet access there. And so it's easier to get on the web there. People have also payment facilities. The banks are more widespread. More than Oceania or Southeast Asia, for instance, or the ACP countries, so to speak. And so crowdfunding was very interesting. So regulators in those regions, the main regions, have taken over to propose a type of regulation that would actually democratize the usage of crowdfunding and have more diversity in investment tools. They also wanted to protect investors against fraud, money laundering, and malignant action on IT networks, etc. So they wanted to protect payment systems on the web. Now, back in 2017, the most attractive fields for crowdfunding were business, entrepreneurship, 41% of the amount collected, and secondly, social and solidarity-based causes, good causes. Now, when it comes to ACP countries, where we can refer to World Bank report, which is back to 2013 actually, but it seems to be still valid today, and it's about crowdfunding's potential for the developing world. Well, according to them, in 2013, crowdfunding was thought to be able to represent the potential of $93 billion a year by 2025 for all developing countries. Now we're currently see a slight increase, but a slight one, of crowdfunding in those ACP countries. Some countries have become some pillars, like in Africa, like in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. They have platforms, they have started working on types of regulations and tools to promote crowdfunding. In those regions, it mostly works on donations and loans. These are the most used investment facilities, so donations represent 90% of the investment activity in Africa. So crowdfunding is an investment tool which can become strategic, it's complementary, and this is what we'll try to show here, especially for starting companies, especially for companies that will lack credibility, especially when it comes to traditional credit institutions like banks. And it's true that crowdfunding brings together different communities which have become loyal to the system, and these communities will communicate about the projects and they will help try out the market's interest for the product or for a service that will be made available there, and that will be proposed for collective funding.
So crowdfunding will give another way of financing capitals and will be a solution to the problems of access to banks and to geographical isolation. For the ACP countries, we can see that crowdfunding could be a tool really to be more included in the entrepreneurial world. It could be quite adequate to fundings of companies. After this overview of the situation of crowdfunding, we will now move on to my second part. So what are really the opportunities, the economic and social opportunities of crowdfunding in the ACP countries? So we've tried to really extract the main arguments, the main topics on this question. Of course, this is not a comprehensive study, but we've led a study on this, and we've tried to offer some arguments that we will mention here, and they are the ones that were the most interesting to explain the interest of crowdfunding for the ACP countries today. So it's a driving force for companies, an economic and financial one. The SMEs are really the driving force of creating employment and for the growth of GDP in the countries. And this is one of the objectives for the emerging countries. However, these SMEs and MSMEs are, as of now, faced with difficulties to find fundings. Often they are described as risky investment for banks. So crowdfunding could be a solution. It could come before the loan at the bank and give more credits and more security to these loans. So first of all, there could be the financing by the diaspora. Why? Well, because in Africa, there is a major diaspora in the ACP countries. The remittances in 2019 sent by the African diaspora to the continent reached nearly 70 billion euros, which represents almost as much as the official development assistance and the share of foreign investment in Africa. These funds are used for the everyday life, and they help the social security. So there is this question: if a part of these funds were invested in the development of the country and in the creation of employment by companies, by crowdfunding channels, this could really represent the opportunity to mobilize a part of these remittances and to offer a growth and relay to use these remittances. In order to do so, we need public policies to help crowdfunding to really channel these remittances throughout secured platforms, crowdfunding platforms, and digital tools. The second example would be B2B financing, which is internal to the companies. There are various forms of financing. The first one I would like to talk about is one that gives visibility to the company throughout crowdfunding. It helps having a more ventilated portfolio with key accounts. For example, in 2019, the African continent saw an increase in investments in its startups in fields such as agri-tech or health. It remained on the margins despite their social and economic impact. Why? Because they lack visibility compared to others, and crowdfunding platforms and participatory platforms improve the distribution of portfolios of specialized funds and large groups. Another example I would like to give for the B2B financing would be the financing between companies. A company that has a surplus cash can choose to invest in a loan or in the capital of another business. Thanks to a participatory financing platform, which would just give visibility to the VSE or SMEs in question. This will improve their financial situation and create a partnership between companies which could strengthen their potential for innovation and competitiveness. There's another argument that has to be mentioned when we talked about the importance of developing crowdfunding for ACP countries. This is a support for financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is really at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals and aims to reduce barriers of financial exclusion and make finance accessible to a population excluded or underserved by conventional financial systems. How can crowdfunding help financial inclusion? First of all, it is accessible to as many people as possible and broadens the circle of investors and the amounts collected, for example, for the startups and entrepreneurs. It allows the investor to directly select their preferred investment opportunities, the projects that really represent their values, the market they are in. It also offers an alternative to the problems of geographical isolation of certain regions and attract local, regional and international investors, thus offering greater opportunities for local production and innovation. So it really channels the funds into some specific areas. Also, crowdfundings would encourage the use of digital tools and the deployment of alternative payment solutions. For example, here we have the mobile payment, which is widely used on the African continent and is really a tool of alternative payment. It's an alternative to the traditional payment system. As of now, we have 1.7 billion people that do not have access to traditional payment systems. So these alternatives would be really a way to give them an entry into the financing scope. Amongst the other arguments we could show, we have here a case of social companies. So it helps redistributing financial flows to the economic sector and corporate growth. Crowdfunding is also a powerful lever for multiple ecosystems in need of complementary funding. Among these actors of social companies are representative of the financing problems encountered in ACP countries. So it's really a problem that is in the core nature of their activities. It's difficult to fund these ecosystems. However, social companies are essential to the community and contribute to the implementation of public policies, particularly in fragile states, by providing public service missions and also allowing to restructure local economies by putting in front of making more visible these ecosystems. And thanks to the British Council, with whom we've had an interview. So the British Council has worked with Social Enterprise Ghana, and they have set up a working group to encourage the creation of crowdfunding platforms to finance Ghanaian social enterprises. Why? Well, because in Ghana, it's just an example amongst other, the financing of social companies has always been seen as a major challenge. And in the working groups, we realized that crowdfunding could open a window of opportunity for investors to invest in projects with positive impacts and to finance the capital of social companies. So we wanted to have a small parenthesis in this report, because it's important to demonstrate that crowdfunding is not only a financial tool, it's also a tool of participatory democracy. It can put the citizen at the center of the democracy and of the economy, the participatory economy. And there are many ways of doing crowdfunding as of now. You can have different ways to submit the project to the decision of the inhabitants. And this way you encourage participatory politics, democracy. So really the citizen, the people are at the center of the decisions. Then there is also for the public authorities the possibility to use crowdfunding to support local actors and promote entrepreneurships, social co-construction, and the emergence of innovative local projects. They will really benefit the growth of the territory. So crowdfunding really makes it possible to place the citizen at the heart of development issues by boosting the local economy and the reappropriation of territory. It also allows to channel the savings of individuals towards projects of general interest, environment, culture, heritage, education, sport, and others. And also by contributing to providing a united response in time of crisis. We have an example here, for example, in the countryside, in the different campaigns for blood donation. We've seen a percentage of growth of more than 450% in 2019, because during the crisis of the pandemics, there were many initiatives to really support the ecosystem, to help the health system, help the different associations that were fighting this health crisis. And so the barometer in France that was released a few days ago showed that really the donation without recompenses was used a lot this year in France. There's a last item in this second part of my presentation. We cannot talk about crowdfunding without talking about the constraints, the limits. It's not a perfect tool. It will not change everything in the ACP countries' finance from a day to the other. It's an alternative solution for the project bearers. It's an example we have in some countries that have been using crowdfunding for years. Really, these platforms are selective. The projects can be denied access to fundraising. So you need to have a correct business plan. You need visibility on what you want to do, on what kind of amount you need. You have to reassure the investors. Also, crowdfunding does not guarantee that the business project will find investors at the end of the day. So there is really a role of significant marketing and communication by the project entrepreneurs to promote, to really boost and give visibility to the project they want to share on these platforms, and really get these investors to finance their projects. Crowdfunding really requires a significant marketing and communication investment. It is not a magical tool. You need to be accompanied by actors of the ecosystem, and really to raise awareness on the different aspects of this. You have to know that as of today, governments, well, more and more governments around the world continue to stimulate crowdfunding, and they promote the use of it, mainly by adopting specific regulatory frameworks to reassure investors, and also to fight fraud and money laundering attempts that may be channeled through digital platforms. This is one of the major challenges in the ACP countries for the development of crowdfunding. So regulation is really a key step that we wanted to mention today. This is not the only one, of course, to propose initiatives via crowdfunding, but really we need to steer the emergence, the growth of crowdfunding. This is why we decided in this third part of this presentation to focus on the regulatory recommendations. In the sector, there are many examples of regulatory reforms that have beared fruit. So it's interesting now to discuss about these recommendations and use the best practices. There have been failures, of course, so we should really take into account the best practices from the reforms, the regulatory reforms that have happened, and propose an economic framework. So for the policies, you need really to have a consultation with the crowdfunding stakeholders, with the regulatory authorities, and the investors. There is an awareness raising session, really work that has to be done beforehand. You need to create synergies, working groups, to have really a framework, regulatory framework built around this. Today we will propose a way of doing this framework. It is not comprehensive, and it was inspired by what happened in 2017, a study by the European Union on the foundation of crowdfunding in the main international practices on countries that have adopted regulatory frameworks and have worked on the authorities and the entities that could control and regulate the crowdfunding. So definition of the regulatory bodies that will be able to approve and control crowdfunding actors and activities, definition of the criteria for setting up crowdfunding platforms according to the nature of their activities, definition of investor protection rules, transparency, and definition of the condition linked to the financing controls. So first, definition of the regulatory bodies regulating the activity. Here we have two examples. First, the example of France. We will talk a lot about France, but France was really one of the pioneer of the regulation of crowdfunding and one of the most well-made regulation. So in 2014, France asked two main institutions to really supervise the use of crowdfunding, the ACPR and the AMF. So these two bodies control the crowdfunding platforms and their use. The ACPR are in charge of loan, and the AMF is for the investments. And there's a third player, OACPS, which is in charge of listing all legal crowdfunding platforms in France. So you have a list, and it allows investors to know in what they are investing, and to be sure that they can be confident that this platform is respecting the regulation. In Morocco now, faced with the reluctance of traditional financial, Morocco has appointed the central bank to supervise crowdfunding activities in the same way as banks. That's what we were saying earlier. There's really a work of raising awareness on crowdfunding. So it's really important to have the traditional actors included and to put forward the different synergies that can exist between the two systems. So it is essential to include a regulation system. Then there is the second aspect, which is the criteria for setting up the platforms. Crowdfunding platforms are the key element of participatory financing. The rules relating to the function of the platform determine the proper execution of crowdfunding. It's also important to have a frame around these platforms to allow them to develop correctly, adequately, the use of crowdfunding as a tool. There's a case here we can mention of the European Union. The European Union has been working on a regulation, the common regulation for crowdfunding inside the EU. This framework was came into force in November 2020, and it is now transposed in the national regulation. So it will be applicable starting in 2021 in November. And this framework, the European framework, offers to the platforms a regime for the crowdfunding for companies that is based on a ORT status, so not a consultative status. So what's the difference? Well, in France, for example, a crowdfunding platform that had the role of consulting in financing could also give consultative arguments to the investors, and they could decide on the capacities of investment of the investors. So there were many tools that were there to work hand in hand with the investors. Well, right now, with this European framework, it is a decreased capacity. The crowdfunding now, platforms are intermediaries. They do not have to really assess the investment capacity of the contributors. They just will use now forms and digital tools, and the investor is autonomous in assessing its own investment capacity. And finally, lies criterion for the methodology to define the condition related to financing operation. The regulator must provide the ecosystem with specific rules to protect contributors, depending on the investment vehicle. So we were talking about this, about the European regulation. So the idea was to define the investors in two groups, the qualified and not qualified investors. The not qualified investors are investors that have never invested on a crowdfunding platform. So the platform will have to publish forms, and the amount of investment will be regulated. They will not be able to go beyond a level that was marked in the regulation, and then they will get this qualified investor profile. Another example, in France, a crowdfunding platform operating in a debt or equity instrument must submit a specific file to an incoming investor. It gather all the steps with explaining the different information, explanation of the process, entry of personal information, entry of the investor profile, with questions that are quite into details, with the capacity, the financing capacity of the investor. Also, there is all the work of downloading the supporting documents to validate the capacity of the investor to contribute in a project that is put forward in this crowdfunding, and also the signature of the investor agreement. Once the application has been validated, the investor has access to the project carried by the crowdfunding platform. So really, there is a whole group of tools that were put into place to regulate and to control all the abuses that could happen with crowdfunding for the investor and the project leaders. It is up to the public authorities to support the platforms to ensure market growth and the sustainability of the sector, to avoid any form of abuse and to control market dynamics, to have always a growth in the market. In all the countries where regulation have happened, there is this really limit of amount accessible to the contributors. So it's a reflection that has to be taken into account in any regulatory process. And to conclude on this report, we proposed a benchmark of two actors for which we had regulations into 2020, which is Morocco and Tunisia. as we've said, it's very interesting for the public authorities, for the countries that want to put forward these regulations, to compare what has been done in other countries and take the good practices of other countries to have really a coherent, a relevant framework, and including all the aspects of crowdfunding. So thank you very much for your attention. And I wanted to, voilà, this first part was there to explain what crowdfunding is.
Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation, and there are many elements for which we believe the members will react and will use in their discussions. So now let's move on with the next part of our agenda, which is about roundtable. So this is my proposal. Every participant and speaker will just tell us who he or she is just in a minute, and in order of appearance on the presentation on the screen. So we'll start with Mazen Kassem. So please introduce yourself in just a sentence and tell us what theme you're most interested in, what elements you'd like to refer to, and what strikes you most, as Camille explained. And I'll ask you a question to shoot after roundtable discussion, of course, in a more structured fashion. So Mazen, you have the floor. Please introduce yourself. Then we'll give the floor to Eric, Thameur, and Alain. Well, thank you, Yasmine, and thanks for the invite to this seminar or webinar. And crowdfunding is a very important matter. It's so interesting. So I'm Mazen Kassem, an international technical expert for Expertise France, focusing on entrepreneurship and innovation. I've been working 18 months on a project in Tunisia to develop the local corporate ecosystem. There, I'm trying to provide support to the Tunisian government to have a new crowdfunding law, a law that was actually voted in August 2020, but that has to be executed. And I'd like to thank you, Camille, by the way, for the presentation. So we like to focus on regulators, the way you need to regulate the market and so on. It's very important. You need to focus on the ecosystem, who should be part of it and so on. Also need to speak about the banks and their role in the discussions. We'll get back to this later on. Thank you. I'm Eric, Ntonfo. We hear you fine, Eric. Please speak. I'm in charge of a participatory funding platform. It's called Fiatope. And Fiatope provides funding to innovative entrepreneurs who have a social impact on the African continent. We've already funded 30 projects, and we're also working with Fiatope Invest, which is an add-on focusing on investment. This is something new we're launching, actually. I'd like to thank you for the invitation today, and I have an introductory observation, which is a follow-up on Camille's introductory speech. So what I would like to say that donation still represents most of the crowdfunding effort now in Africa, and for many reasons. Now this could be key to understand the future of crowdfunding and turn it into investment. Thank you. Hi everyone. I'm Thameur Hemdane, the founder of 2 crowdfunding platforms focusing on Africa. So we have Afrikwity, which is an investment platform, which is an equity crowdfunding. Also co-chair the Participatory Funding Association for the Méditerranée and Africa, which brings together crowdfunding stakeholders and promote good practices in crowdfunding in the Mediterranean and Africa. And Camille mentioned GIZ report. I was the expert behind the report, so I was pleased to hear about that, because I heard that the regulatory work was taken into account. I'd like to thank you for that, Camille. This is something we focused on in Tunisia. We also made a presentation for Morocco and also focus on this with other regulators in French-speaking Africa. So thank you again, Camille, for your presentation. We'll get back to this in a moment, I'm sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Alain Nkurikiye, Director and founder of Wajenzi. Wajenzi is a participatory investment platform working with the diaspora that can invest in the startup companies in their countries of origin. So we currently work in Ghana and Uganda, and we try to help startup companies get investment from the diaspora. What I really liked in Camille's presentation is that there is an opportunity to open possibilities to invest to diaspora. And so one of the main problems we're having as a platform is that we need to deal with money laundering and the lack of regulation. So we're looking for a model that would be suited to Africa. So I wanted to discuss this again and see what opportunities we can discuss. Thank you. Well, thank you, the four of you. So here is question 1 for you guys. So maybe this is even going against what was said before by Camille, but maybe not that much anyway. So is it really necessary to have crowdfunding regulation? Is it really necessary, as we could hear, and as it is the case now in the EU or Morocco, Tunisia? Or do you think it's enough to just let the ecosystem move on its own and grow and then regulate it afterwards? I'll first give the floor to Thameur and Mazen, because they know Tunisia and Morocco, where regulation is in place now. So how did you seem to agree on the need to have regulations on board? So why did that just you leave things as is, or as were? All right, thank you. Let me provide a first answer. Well, I thought it was necessary to provide a framework. A framework doesn't necessarily mean a full regulation, but in the countries we discussed with, they really wanted a detailed regulation, specific regulation actually. Why? Well, there are two important elements, I believe. First, the crowdfunding activities in countries like Tunisia, Morocco, and even others, the ECOWAS countries, for instance, well, we directly face existing regulations that were very strict. If you want to do crowdfunding and loans, well, you have to face the bank monopolies, see? So if you come up with a digital platform, a web platform, it's hard to comply with this type of regulation. It's hardly possible because the framework would not allow it. The same goes for small crowdfunding initiatives. You had to abide by strict regulations on private equity. And even donations in those countries was already regulated in Tunisia, for instance. So for each donation, you would have needed authorizations from the ministry. So the environment was not good for this type of initiative, so it was necessary to provide more flexibility. We had to provide more types of support to make such activities easier. This is why we work with different stakeholders in this type of ecosystem to actually move forward with the project and implement reform with the regulators. Now, if you take the platforms viewpoint, well, the platforms needed elements to strengthen trust, to improve trust for ecosystems or two ecosystems. So we have an unknown internet platform. They're entering an ecosystem and they start asking money. Generally speaking, people won't trust that, you know, that they're working with financial flows because they don't seem to have been approved by the ministry. So it works both ways. You need support to find the right framework for development. You should avoid issues and causing problems, and then you should help platforms get trust from the different players in the ecosystem. Thank you, Mazen. But I fully agree. There's no such thing as a good or bad example. Tunisia has in its DNA a regulatory framework for everything. So things are still very rigid there. So we have countries with their DNA, like the ones have a more liberal approach with competition, then they try to actually harness it. And then other countries start with the regulation right away, and from time to time they try to provide some flexibility. And this particular case in Tunisia or Morocco or ACP countries, what's clever is that we have a regulatory framework which is being adapted to the regulation or to the tool. Thank you. Well, thank you. Now speak to Alain and Eric, because you've worked in countries where there is no such regulatory framework. So how do you make do with that absence actually of regulation? What are the problems? What are your solutions? I'll give the floor to Alain first because his webcam is on, but we'll listen to Eric afterwards. All right, thank you for your question. It's true that it's a problem for us, especially when you want to help the diaspora investors invest in Africa, including in Uganda and Ghana. So to reach this purpose, we had to create a new business model to allow the diaspora to invest, but also to help local entrepreneurs get the money from the diaspora. We wanted to create a climate of trust between the different stakeholders. So we created an investment fund. Different investment funds actually, and the investment funds are in charge of managing the investment the money coming from the diaspora, from expats who left the country. So they're running that. So in the Netherlands, we created a specific investment fund for the diaspora. So there we collect all the money from the diaspora through a single company, which in turn invests in Uganda or in the other country. So if you look at the current structure, well, you see that it enables us to start working and at least to start discussions with the lawmakers to make sure that we could adapt the current system. Thank you. Eric, your turn. Yes. We'd say the following. When we heard Thameur, we spoke about regulation and so on. Then many sub-Saharan African countries where the participatory funding is so reduced and it's subject to so many barriers, and so many people have a hard time accessing to online tools, actually, or get online payments, you know, well, it's hard to move on. So it can be very problematic if you make a law, because if you make a law, you become more restrictive. We see there that the central banks and the countries somehow like to allow too many rules. Because a rule could kill a new initiative or a small funding initiative that could actually be beneficial to a project. If you take Cameroon, where the Ministry of Finance last year organized great meetings on crowdfunding. I think it was one of the first such initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa. And so they spent a day on that. And as said by the public authorities, they wanted to better understand what it's all about, to understand what's behind that. And the minister actually contacted different crowdfunding platforms to pay them a visit. And he was aware that we should not actually kill the initiative from scratch by over-regulating. If you take the COAS, well, if we want to move there are facilities to invest in some companies. If you start a company in Mali or Senegal, if you have less than 99 people, you don't need a regulatory framework that's too rigorous. So these are as many opportunities that can already be used to move forward with crowdfunding in those areas. Thank you. So much for me. Well, thank you, Eric. Great feedback. It's interesting. Now, beyond regulation on crowdfunding, and that should be regulated by actually public policies, what are the other prerequisites? And I mean here prerequisites that could support the appearance of crowdfunding instruments here in ACP countries. But it's all about the relationship between the crowdfunding players with the banking sector. Because sometimes banks relate in a strange fashion to crowdfunding. Some can be interested because it could foster growth, but others are afraid of crowdfunding. What do you believe about this? What's your experience? I'm not sure who would like to speak about this first. I know that Alain got support from a bank for a certain time. Would like to say something, Alain? All right, thank you for your question. Yes, we work with financial institutions. We tested out a model where the diaspora and a bank invest together. They invest in a startup company or a small business, and it works quite well. They're from the Netherlands. The Rabobank, you know, it's a Dutch bank, and we have a partner in Uganda, and we're preparing a pilot project. So for us, partnerships with the banks is, how can I put it, something that's very interesting. So we're trying to be innovative there because we're still lacking services where private investors and banks can actually work together. So this is a service we created, and we propose financial products to invest with a bank. Now, the main issue comes to the quality of investors, entrepreneurs also on the platform. That's a problem for us. Otherwise, our partnership with the banks is quite natural. So we're active with people who have interest in Africa, in the Netherlands. Now there's another problem with the capital market in some countries, which does not really enable us to get people mobilized in Africa. So that's the situation. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to provide additional information to what Alain just said. I think this is an important element. It's about education. It's about educating regulators, lawmakers, or banks, and other stakeholders in the ecosystem. We need to educate. We need to explain, make them understand, as Camille said in her presentation. We need to explain the fundamentals and explain how this becomes compatible with other funding tools. And this is what was done. And maybe today in Africa and the ACP region, we're lucky. We're lucky because we're lagging behind. And so we see what was done elsewhere in the EU, the US, and so on. And we see that the relationship between the traditional funders like banks and crowdfunding players are quite strong. So banks remain financial partners, the usual type of partners, but several banks have invested or taken over crowdfunding platforms because it contributes to their digital transformation, actually. So I think this is quite healthy and normal. And I think that many banks now in Africa have understood that it is interesting to work with these stakeholders like fintechs, and now we need to reckon with regulated players like banks, and they have a hard time working with other stakeholders which are still in a gray area. But there's some legal void. So the regulation will foster the appearance of such partnerships, I would say, to the mid to long term. And among the conditions, and we spoke about education before, you have to work with banks, of course, but also other players in the ecosystem. So we insisted on the need of sourcing patterns. You need patterns, projects, good projects, quality project, but you need good quality, projects, project leaders, and so on and so on. So we need other elements in the ecosystem to make sure everybody works together. And then you have people who need to save money. If people want to invest, they need to know about the investing tools. If the people who don't have the capacity to put money on the table or the tools to do it, it will be hard. You see, so crowdfunding will only develop if you enjoy a whole infrastructure, a whole ecosystem to host it, and who knows what it's all about. So regulation is an essential element, but it's not enough to develop crowdfunding.
If I can add something. Go ahead, yeah, go ahead. To add on what Thameur was saying, banks are a key actor. They might not participate in crowdfunding as such, because they are not the owner of a platform or nor the shareholder of a platform. They are a major actor because it gives access to the financial scheme. I can give you an example of a Tunisian platform that does the work in the association, the social work. It is not as of now regulated, but it is valid as the law stipulates it. And they've led a campaign to fundraise, and their accounts were blocked because they realized that there were many entries or many investments in these accounts, and so the crowdfunding did not lead to a success. Their accounts were blocked, and they had to explain. And at the end of the day, they got their account back. But what you have to take away from this is that they had to reimburse the contributors, and they had also to admit that the crowdfunding was not working, and the bank was not understanding why they had to reimburse all these actors. So there is this awareness raising to do with the banks and also all the financial actors about crowdfunding, to know how it works, it's very important. So raising awareness, communicating is key, really. Even before we implement a regulatory framework, you have to do this communication work with all the actors of the system. Otherwise, it's impossible to get the benefit from this tool. It should be really operational, and to be able to use it, we need a critical mass. And maybe to build some step on this, my colleagues have said a lot. 2 points on the bank. Banks first have to understand that they are a legislative asset that is essential right now, because they are the only one that can give funds to third accounts. And this is a capacity that is absolutely essential to crowdfunding, because crowdfunding platforms do not keep the money. So without the banks, it's difficult to evolve. And in France, we have this idea of service providers for payment that help using funds that are platforms crowdfunding. So banks really have a role to play, because they can easily play this role. Even if in Europe, this is not the case. Another point on which the banks have to work, it's the capacity to acquire money online, because they are a bit, they are not on the dated on this. So we've understood during this pandemic that it's very important to have ways of paying online. And we can see that banks right now are still focused on their clients with deposits, with money deposit, cash deposits. And they do not really understand how important, how essential it is to acquire turnover online. And banks have to also to get used to getting money online. This is the way things will go further. Europe, as of now, they are not used to this. And so really, I think that banks have a lot of work to do to build capacities and to develop and transform to the digital area. Yasmine, if I can add something about banks. As Alain said before, we have our platform.
So today we're having many difficulties with the banks in Europe, for whom we've been collecting money, saved money by the diaspora to invest in Africa. And they don't really want to become a platform that will transfer the money, because they could be facing money laundering issues and funding of terrorism. So because of that, it's slowing down development and the mobilization of the diaspora for productive investment in Africa. So it's about education. This education work has to be done with the banking partners in Europe to make sure that the flows keep developing. And as said before, we have to improve the flows from the diaspora. And I believe that the flows of the diaspora and their investment will contribute to the development of crowdfunding in Africa and ACP countries, because they will become early adopters, you know. So they've already used crowdfunding in their countries of destination, the EU, the US, and so on. So they will actually use it to fund projects in their own countries of origin. And so thanks to them, they can move forward. It was the case in the Lebanon and Israel. the flows of crowdfunding have been boosted at the beginning thanks to the diaspora. So there are questions about diaspora. How can we make sure that crowdfunding can become more attractive, and how can we make sure it can turn people into early adopters? So we heard all the questions and comments you made on the importance to educate and teach and communicate. And beyond the very use of education to make sure that the banks trust us, how can we make sure that investors trust this, so that they can trust the people who want to invest after the in the countries of origin? And how can we show that crowdfunding can be the great tool for that? I don't know who would like to speak now, who would like to react. Alain, you have the floor. Go on.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I would like to talk about the methodology we've implemented to use the remittances from the diaspora. So first we had a warranty funds that is based in Nairobi to protect 50% of the investment from the diaspora. So for example, if you invest 20,000 euros in a startup in Africa, well, you get back 10,000 if there is a bankruptcy. So this is the first thing we did. And then we also were quite clear on the criteria we used to decide on which startup we invested on. So our criteria are really clear. Also, we had clubs, which is the diaspora business angel networks. In these clubs, we really teach to the diaspora how to invest. We have 330 members in these clubs of the man, and the member of these clubs meet the other members. And well, this is the different steps we've implemented. We also have coaching, mentoring for diaspora area. If a member of the diaspora wants to coach and has a startup in which they have invested, it can then create a partnership between the coach and the startup to keep the communication working. And the third point, and this is really essential for us, it is the portfolio management. On the created environment on which the investor from a company A can follow the progress of the startup. If he or she sees a problem,
So actually, here we can create more trust into the investment facility. Thank you. Anybody else would like to react on the diaspora? Right. Well, thank you. What I hear with the diaspora, I hear that a lot actually, is that people have different types of expectations. And one of the first challenges is that you need to set categories of expectations. There we have people who like to do something for their country. They don't expect anything in return for or from their investment. That's how they send or give a hand back. People in Canada say they don't care. They just want to give something back for their country of origin. And then you have another category of persons in the diaspora who are more classical financial investors. And these people actually expect something in return, something back. So maybe we need to look for different answers according to the audience we're working with. So because these people will require different mechanisms, some want a guarantee fund, which is necessary for some, but for others not. For those who just give their own money out and those who have different things in mind and maybe have to use different arguments to track them, like social matters, etc. And so it is necessary to give these investors the feeling that they have done something good for their country of origin and that they've been successful in what they do. Thank you. Thank you. Eric, let's be short on this one. Yeah, I'll make it short. Simply wanted to insist on what Alain said when it comes to good practices. Yes, this is what you need to do. You need good practices, like he said, and I'd like to provide some nuance to what Eric said. Because I'm not sure that investors from the diaspora are not all hesitant or reluctant, but sometimes, you know, the diaspora, well, that's investors. They're investors, so you need to speak to them as investors. Investors for whom something more emotional can be at stake, which is the impact in their countries of origin. And social business here is a great asset they could invest in. Now, there's something which I believe is important. It's trust. You need to create trust with diaspora. So we should not neglect the institutional approach that should be creating trust for the diaspora. For example, once we had the AFD logo and other institutions' logos on our platform because we got funding from those players and because we got support, it changed everything and people gained trust in the diaspora. They said, okay, these are unknown players for us, but they are supported by known people. So it makes things easier. They finally trust you. So it makes the relationship with the diaspora and the financial players easier. Thank you. Well, thank you, Thameur. So we should be closing now. I hope you agree that we take 10 more minutes because there are still 2 questions I'd like to deal with. 2 interesting questions asked on the chat platform. First question, well, Camille, in her presentation, said that what's specific of crowdfunding with the African continents are there more donations, actually. Some of you mentioned that too. So in Africa, we see there are more donations. So this will help us reach more or less smaller companies that do solidarity work, and so on and so on. So people are asking on the chat box how we can make the crowdfunding models in Africa more inclusive compared to what we know in the more developed countries. So how can crowdfunding models work with more fragile companies or work with potential investors where there are fewer banks or where there is fewer online services, for example? So what could be done there? Will anybody like to react on this? So I would like to say something here. No. What we say, Wajenzi, is that you need true selection criteria to propose a platform. So what are the criteria we use to attract startup companies? First, we look into the team. We do not invest in micro companies. We invest in startups which already have a team of 3 or 4 people. Then we look at the potential market for their solutions. We look into the potential for this company to grow even beyond the national borders. And then if you look into innovation, you need to look if there's already a prototype available. And then we invest a minimum of 50 to 250,000 euros. So we invest with financial institutions to provide starting capital to startup companies. And this is the way to go. This is how we can build companies in Africa. This is our vision. I don't know if somebody shares that. I would like to react. Yes, I could react and add some additional comments. I'd like to refer to some figures that are part of an alternative funding report of the Cambridge Institute. And they show that in Africa, 18% of the population enjoying crowdfunding do not have a bank account or are not that present in the banking system as compared to what goes on in the EU or the US, where people without a bank account are lower than 7% of the beneficiaries. So we see that crowdfunding will contribute to financial inclusion, generally speaking, across Africa. So they could do more if they have the possibility to further develop. So now, I believe it is an element. It is a financial tool that supports inclusion. And you see that most of the volumes in Africa go to them, and they contribute to financial inclusion. It's hard to provide money to the informal sector with a loan or another type of investment, so there's no other way to go. Although I still doubt that this money will truly fund an economic activity. Most of the time, I believe it's still social support or cultural projects. All right, thank you, Thameur. Another question, the last one. Question coming from people who are following us. Here I have a question about what's going on in Tunisia and Morocco. First question. With the implementation of those regulations, although they're very new, have you noticed an increase of the money raised, the funds raised, and the number of participants in such operations? And question number 2, when in Tunisia, for instance, could you use crowdfunding to reduce some issues? Like, could you fund companies which are no longer true startups, but for whom the funding is still complex to get, hard to get? Well, Yasmine, be it in Morocco, Tunisia, unfortunately, we're still focusing on regulatory framework. If you take Tunisia, the law was approved in August 2020. And since then, well, the partners and institutions have finalized the decrees and they have tried to update the text according to the local needs. So we're not there yet. And it's hard to assess the impact of crowdfunding in Tunisia. So the missing needle there is a very important theme, and I think it should be part of our work as experts and as technical agencies, especially those that will support the Tunisian institutions. So we need to make sure that this law should become operational. It should be executed to make sure we no longer have this missing link. But we're still far from that, unfortunately. Could have another discussion in a year's time, maybe, and share results on that. Thank you. All right, for the missing needle, it's a bit early to provide answers. And if you look at experience on other continents, given the very nature of crowdfunding per se, we see that it's a series of small funders, donors behind the project. If you take the bank's rationale, the risk has been split. So individually, they're ready to take more risk with a small amount, and a big institution would put all the money on the table. So because of that, we'll cover projects that are a bit more, I would say, risky. More than what we could expect from traditional players so far. And so this is what we expect to do now together. Well, thank you. So it's all very interesting. We'd like to move on with the discussion, but unfortunately, this is the end of this webinar. So I'd like to conclude by saying the following. First, let's have a small reminder with the next about the next webinars that will be organized by the ICR facility. On the 25th of February, we'll have a webinar in English on democratization of access to social finance. So this webinar will focus on Pacific and Caribbean companies, and the time will be adapted. It will be 9 p.m. European time to make sure that the audience in the Caribbean can attend, and the Pacific. And on the 11th of March, we have a webinar on pre-donors as a useful investment and tool to support investors in ACP countries. Then I would like to answer a question that was asked many times in the chat box. And there we need to see how we'll discuss this and how we can take contact with different stakeholders. So as you know, and we should display a slide there on the screen. Well, whatever, doesn't matter. So there you go. So for those participants who are interested, we're making a proposal. If you have questions for the Mipise consultants who worked on the report that was presented at the beginning of this webinar, well, we could organize a 1-hour session with them to ask them questions, ask for support and details. So please let us know if you're interested before the 25th of February to the address on the screen. You see the email address. Then you have to tell us who you are, introduce yourself and your organization, tell us where you're based, and just ask us your questions. Questions for the Mipise consultants and advisors. So much for me. If you're interested, well, just send us your questions in writing per email. You have this on the screen that we'll discuss with you. I wanted to thank all the speakers for the quality of their speeches, the content they shared. It's so interesting, and I'm sure we have to stop this now. I hope we can further discussion in other venues and places. It was very interesting. I've learned a lot. I would also like to thank the people who've been listening to us, our audience. Thank you for your attention for 1.5 hours. Thank you, Camille, for your presentation and moderation. We're really looking forward to reading the report. So this should be published on the website of the ICR facility in, let's say, a month's time. So thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye-bye.